What's going on, U.S. history students? Today is Tuesday, the day after Labor Day. In today's video, we're going to talk about the American Revolution. The American Revolution lasted from 1765 to 1783 and is the reason you're all in my class. We have to learn about our history, the United States history. And the kind of general starting point for a lot of people is the revolution. A lot goes down, pretty important, and we got to understand what's happening. So make sure to like and subscribe in whatever corner it is. Have your water bottles ready. Have your salsa and chips and Cheez-Its by your side or whatever you're snacking on. And let's go on this adventure. So we're going to talk about the American Revolution, okay? So as we've been talking about, there's been a lot of tension between the colonists and the British Empire. And a lot of that tension is caused by the taxation without representation that we've talked about, the quartering of troops, and just the other variety of just social and cultural differences between the British and the colonies. And so this really boils over. And as we get into the mid-1770s, this is going to lead to fighting. So what happens is we first get what's known as the First Continental Congress. This is in 1774. And this is following the turmoil and turbulent times that were going on in the colonies. A meeting was held where the delegates from all the colonies, except for Georgia, they would be around for the second meeting that ends up happening a little bit later. They just weren't there for this one. These delegates come together and they discussed how best to go forward and deal with the British. And so think of the word delegate, and I threw it in there. It's just a fancy name for politician, someone who is a delegate on your behalf. I think, we have, if they represent your region, your state, they'd be your delegate. Some of the delegates thought that going to war with the British was a fool's errand. It would be a mistake. It would result in even worse things because a lot of people didn't think that we could actually win in the war against the British. You gotta understand, at this time, the British Empire was the most powerful country in the world. It, was found, the British had colonized almost the entire globe. They had a big navy. They were well funded, and they were very powerful. And so how could these 13 different colonies really fight against this huge empire? And that was kind of the thing. No one was really sure if it was possible. Other people thought that maybe they could figure out and broker a peace deal, eventually earn independence through peace. But inevitably, the outcome of the meeting, when people walked away, what they really understood is that the colonies wanted to form their own government that was completely separate from the British. Now, whether that meant going to war or trying to do it in another way, maybe trying to broker a deal somehow, what was clear is that the colonies wanted to be independent from Britain and they wanted to form their own kind of nation state. That's what's important about the First Continental Congress. Of course, because it's a revolutionary war, we're not going to broker a deal with the British. There's going to be no peace. There's going to be fighting. As time went on, it became clear that fighting and a war was inevitable. And so early fighting breaks out in Lexington, which is up in New England, in the northeast part of the country. That's where a lot of these events happen. And this happens in 1775. So the British kind of knew that if war was inevitable, they wanted to make sure to crush the Americans quickly and easily. They didn't want to spend a long time trying to fight off these, soldiers and whatnot. And so the British looked to take an early advantage, and they wanted to capture an important armory from the American colonists. So as they marched towards this armory, it was made aware that they were on their way to take the weapons and burn down the armory and make sure the colonists had nothing to defend themselves. This is where this guy, Paul Revere, you might have learned this story back in middle school, made his famous midnight ride, and he rides on his horse saying, "The British are coming, the British are coming." And he warns the people ahead of time as the British are marching. Remember, there's no planes back in these days, so if you wanted to move an army, you had to march them or take them by horse. There's not even cars yet. As a result, a small group of Minutemen, these are patriots. Remember, we talked about what a patriot is, someone who is supportive of a revolution. Um, they're named for how quick they can be ready to fight. They're ready in a minute, hence Minutemen. They met the overwhelmingly much larger British force in Lexington, and fighting broke out. People were killed, shots were fired. And this is kind of what most historians would signify and circle as the first real battle or skirmish of the American Revolution. And the revolution had begun at this point. And so people in the colonies had to choose their side. Were you going to stay loyal and be a loyalist to the British? Or were you going to fight and form a new country? And if you were alive in this time, you had to make a decision. And as we learned, about a third of people were willing to fight and fight for revolution were patriots. A third of people want to remain loyal to the British, and a third of people were kind of in the middle and wishy-washy. Here's just an image depicting Paul Revere's midnight ride, warning people. He was on horseback with his lantern, screaming, telling people to be ready. The next big event we need to know about is the Declaration of Independence. This is signed on July 4th. Was signed on July 2nd, ratified and adopted on July 4th. That's why we celebrate the 4th of July in honor of this document in 1776. While fighting was kind of popping off across the colonies, the most important minds and delegates of the revolution came together and they signed a Declaration of Independence. This declaration formally severed ties between the colonies and the British. To declare something means to state, and to be independent means to be one, yourself, right? So to say, I declare my independence is to say, I'm my own person, I have my own freedoms. You should do that the next time you break up with someone. You should write them a letter or even send them a text and say, this is my Declaration of Independence, and then just put a GIF of Thomas Jefferson or George Washington. You should do that. I'll give you 10 points extra credit. Just kidding, maybe. So the Declaration of Independence is arguably the most important document in modern world history. As many other nations have used it as a guide for forming their own independence document, and it's a source of inspiration for revolutions. If you took my world history class, it was a big source of inspiration for the French during the French Revolution. It's also really important in American cultural identity, and it's a symbol of freedom and independence by any means. And while in some ways that's good, it's also kind of bad because unfortunately in our culture, we value our freedom and independence so much that we're willing to hurt other citizens so we can have our freedoms. Think about the people that don't wear masks that go into stores, right? These people are so selfish that they aren't even willing to just put on a mask because it's their freedom. It's kind of the weird part about American culture is we value our freedom because it had to be fought for, and people are so tied to that. And as time has gone on, that's become a part of people's culture and identity, especially for us as Americans. More so for other people than some, but it's kind of a big deal. And that's why we talk about the Declaration of Independence. We'll talk a little bit more about it in our next lesson, which is all about kind of American identity and culture as a result from the early foundations of our country. Take a look at the room. You'll notice a bunch of old white men. That is how our country was founded. So the reason we have, and we'll talk more about this really tomorrow, pretty much the only people that signed the Declaration of Independence were all older white men. Thomas Jefferson was the guy who kind of was most famously the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, but a bunch of other people were there who signed it, right? The founding fathers, as they're said, James Madison was there. You have, the Benjamin Franklins, the Sam Adams, the George Washingtons, right? The founding fathers. But as we'll talk about more tomorrow, the problem with this picture is that in our country, we have to live by a constitution that was written kind of for one demographic, people that look like Mr. Tomei. And the reality is the country doesn't look like Mr. Tomei, and that's probably a good thing. So we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but just keep in mind, this is just an image of the painting of what happened in the room. You see here, you can go see the Declaration of Independence if you go to Washington, D.C., or you can steal the Declaration of Independence like Nicolas Cage did. I realized I forgot to insert a meme, so I'll do that after this video. National Treasure, iconic, probably top 10 films of all time. Recommend you watch it. Yeah, you can go visit this document today. And if you've ever been or ever gotten the chance, I've never been to DC. I'd like to go one day. And it'd be one of the things I'd like to see. It's a pretty important part of history. Okay. After the Declaration of Independence, in the early days of the Revolution, America, we were taking those, that's an L. I don't know which way is an L for you guys. We were holding them L's, okay? We were just nowhere near as experienced. We weren't as well funded. The Americans just were not really good soldiers. The people who made up the American Continental Army were farmers, merchants, 50, 60-year-old men fighting for their farm. They just were not professional trained soldiers. We didn't even have our own real Navy, really on the same scale of what the British had. So we were completely just outgunned, outmanned. Hashtag Hamilton stands, right? You know where that line comes from. Ooh, that rhymed. Ooh, spitting fire. Check out my SoundCloud. So a lot of this really made it seem like we were not going to win. And it wasn't looking good early because we were just really, really outmatched early on. Take a look at the flags. The top flag, that is the first flag, the Betsy Ross flag, the 13 stars representing the 13 colonies. And then the flag below would represent, that's known as the Union Jack, that would represent the British Empire. This is an image of a battle. You see how the British soldiers are all uniformed the same way. But if you look carefully at the American side, you'll notice there's a mix of soldiers in uniform, but also people that kind of look like they live out kind of in the woods. Those are more the Minutemen, but they would work with the army. And again, it was just a ragtag group of people fighting for a revolution. As in many ways, a lot of revolutions, that's how it happens. So we kind of needed a pick-me-up. We needed a W. We needed a win. And we got one. We got one when George Washington crosses the Delaware River in the Battle of Trenton, which is in New Jersey, which is kind of in the mid-Atlantic. So a brave and brash general named George Washington, he looked to turn the tide of the revolution. And so on Christmas night, George Washington and his army crossed the Delaware River. I should capitalize Delaware too, huh, Tyler? And took the British by surprise at the Battle of Trenton. The American, it wasn't a huge strategic important battle, but in terms of a morale booster, it was really big. It gave people confidence to keep fighting. It kept soldiers in the fight, and they, prevented, stopped soldiers from abandoning their post, and, kept their spirits up when things were looking really, really bleak. And an important thing to highlight too is that, typically to attack on Christmas night was seen as like kind of like rogue. People, there was like a code of ethics, a secret code, that you don't attack on holidays and things like that. But George Washington didn't care because he wanted to get a W. And so that's how we get this iconic photo. You notice the water, that's ice. So as people are rowing the boat, they have to move the ice because the ice could potentially like puncture the boat. And of course you have George Washington looking all stoic and leader-like, very iconic painting in American history. But here's kind of what helps us turn around. It's kind of ironic because they always get roasted on the history memes that I follow. The French come out and bail us out. So for many years before the revolution even started, the British and the French had a deep rivalry. I need to change that. Had a deep-seated rivalry and had fought wars against each other. And They even fought wars in America known as the French Indian War. We don't really talk about it, but you can look it up if you want. Um, and so the French kind of saw the revolution as a way to take advantage over the British and kind of get back at them and, just try and get at their enemy. They had also secretly been funding the Americans since the start of the war. Shout out the big homie Ben Franklin, who's on the $100 bill. He played a really huge part in this. He spent a lot of time in France chumming up with the, powerful people and getting the royalty and the aristocracy to be down to support this movement. Eventually, France came to our aid, and they sent the Americans a navy because France had a well-developed navy, a bunch of reinforcements of French soldiers, and a bunch of supplies. And this was like a huge, like when Popeye eats his spinach and he goes boom, boom, and he like knocks out the bad guy. That's pretty much what happened to us. And most historians would agree that this was kind of the biggest turning point, the ultimate X factor that really determined and helped the Americans secure victory against the British. This is just a bunch of major Revolutionary War battle sites. We don't have time because of the circumstances of this year to really talk about them. So, if you're really into history, you can look into them and look into these battles. These are some of the big ones. But yeah. And also, next time you think of making fun of the French, remember, although it's easy, they bail us out in the revolution. So we should be a little chill with them sometimes. Hashtag memes. And eventually, the revolution wraps up, and surprise, we win. And Americans, we win in Yorktown in 1781. Ultimately, in the end, the British saw the American Revolution as just a losing effort. Even if the British wanted to stick it out, it was going to take a lot of time. It was going to cost a lot of money, a lot of lives. And eventually the British were like, we got territories everywhere else. We don't need to keep dabbling with these Americans. Sure, let them be independent. They'll screw it up and come back to us. No problem. That's how they rationalized it. And so they deuced out and they checked out and they left. And this was really kind of after the defeat at Yorktown by the British, is where they kind of formally surrendered. And then finally, about 2 years later, there was a peace treaty that formally ended the war. And as a result, America now was this newfound nation. Here's what the legacy of the revolution is. Ultimately, it demonstrated that the willpower of a united people can overthrow a greater power. That still holds true to this day. If a united group of people can come together, you can overthrow a great power. There's a little bit of luck that needs to happen, right time, right place, and you got to be united, but it is doable. The revolution is also a fundamental part of American identity and culture for a lot of Americans. We kind of touched on that earlier, but the concept of freedom and independence by any means necessary still holds true today in our society. Think of the people that don't wear masks, other things like that, right? The idea of my freedom is more important than your safety. Kind of crazy, but hashtag super American. We are not a very collective society. We're very independent ourselves. Stay away. This is my property, things like that. That's why Karens kind of get crazy sometimes. It's laid the groundwork for a lot of other countries to rise up against the British. And if you were in my world history class, you might have learned about that. And it gave birth to the United States. It's why we're talking about this. You're in my class. And for better or for worse, the United States is the most powerful country the modern world has ever seen. Doesn't mean we're necessarily the best at everything, but in terms of power, it's pretty hard to argue that there's countries that are more powerful than the United States, even with Trump as president. And he's done a great job of trying to make us really weak. But that's going to change in November. So now what happens? Sure, we won this war, but now what? What do we do? How do we go forward? What are the laws we make? What are the rules and regulations and the taxes, and how do we pay for things? What do we do about these colonies? Do we form states? What's a state? A lot of questions had to be answered. And that's where our next video is going to take us, as we talk into the foundation of America. We talk about the Constitution. We talk about how that impacts our identity, our culture, our cultural values. I will talk more on that in the next video. Make sure to go ahead and like and subscribe wherever it is. And make sure to go ahead and do the corresponding assignment that goes along with this video. Besides that, I hope you take care and have a great day, and talk to you later.